Genesis 1 isn't actually trying to prove God exists, which is weird because most of us think that's what it's about. Genesis 1 never argues for God, it never explains where he comes from, and it never defends him. Now, instead, it starts with an assumption, and that assumption changes the way we read the Bible. In a few minutes, I'll show you exactly what Genesis 1 was doing, why it actually mattered then, and why it still matters today. And yes, we'll try to explain some of the crazy wording of the King James Version. Genesis 1 was written by people who already believed in God, but they were surrounded by cultures with all kinds of other beliefs. Now, every one of these nations had their own creation story, and a lot of them went like, the gods fight, chaos wins, humans are slaves. But then Genesis 1 enters the world and it's like, nah, that's not how this works. So when you dig deep into it, this chapter isn't asking, does God exist? It claims he exists. What it's really asking is, what does that God look like? The Bible begins with one of the clearest sentences ever written. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. But in Hebrew, that sentence isn't as clear as it is in English. No, the Hebrew word for beginning is reshit. Usually doesn't mean a starting point, usually describes a process. And when we look at Genesis 1 like this, it becomes less about origin and more about order. But in verse 2, it describes the earth as being without form and void. In Hebrew, that phrase is tohu vavohu. And that doesn't mean nothing, it actually means uninhabitable chaos. Dark water, no structure, no boundaries, no purpose. And here's the key idea. God doesn't fight battles by fighting chaos. He organizes it. Unlike other creation stories, there's no battle, no struggle, no other gods, just speech. And over, as we're reading the text, we'll even see that. It says the words, and God says. Now, the Hebrew word for this is actually amar. Amar more means like simple speech. And then it continues on to tell us that light exists because God speaks. Life begins because God speaks. And that's not poetry for effect. That's theology. Genesis basically states that reality itself responds to God's voice. And then as we get deeper, we notice the pattern, right? Separation, naming, purpose. God isn't just making stuff. He's assigning roles. And then we get to humans. Now, in ancient myth, humans existed to literally feed the gods. But in Genesis, for the first time, we're seeing that we're actually made in the image of God. Now, the image of God is actually the Hebrew word salem, and salem means more like a representative, usually used to describe statues of gods. In other words, that's like saying humans were placed in creation to be a representative of God's love. Now, that's wild. For the first time in history, we're seeing that humans aren't slaves, they're stewards. And then we see on day 7 that God rests. That's not because he's tired, that's because creation is complete. In the ancient world, gods rested in temples. Our God is saying that basically the entire world and all of its cosmos are his temple. And then we get to the point where we see creation isn't random. It's good, it's ordered, it has purpose. So let's get back to that opening claim, that Genesis 1 does not show us that God exists. In fact, it assumes that you already know he does, and what it's trying to do is explain to you our purpose and what he's like. He brings order, not chaos. He breaks chains, doesn't take prisoners. He doesn't fight other gods. He speaks things into existence. That makes Genesis 1 less of a lesson or a textbook and more of a declaration about who really is in charge of the universe. And that's important because the rest of the Bible kind of assumes that you understand this fact. Next time, Genesis 2 zooms in and things get a lot more personal. This has been Bible in 10 minutes or less. I'll see you in the next one.